Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Sam Kernahan, the Director of the Committee for Sydney's Resilience Program. It's great to see so many of you here today for this discussion on the Greater Sydney Water Strategy. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land, wherever you may be this morning. I'm on the land of the Camaragal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their leaders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank our sponsor for today's resilience briefing, Sydney Water. And thank you also to the Committee for Sydney's Innovation Fund partners, Campbelltown City Council, Dexus, ICC Sydney, McKinsey & Company, Western Sydney University and the University of Sydney for their ongoing support to the work the committee does. I'll introduce our great speaker lineup in just a moment, but first a quick explanation of how we'll run things today. Our speakers are going to share some insights and perspectives from state and local government, from research and implementation, and then we'll dig into the details and conversation. We'd love your questions to help us do that. As always, if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand in the raise your hand function or type it in the Q&A and I'll do my best to get them to them all. And I'm sure you're all used to this by now, but if you can turn your cameras on when we get to that conversation, it's a better opportunity for everyone. So why are we talking about water? While our main water supply dam hit 100% on Sunday night, the drought conditions of 2017 to 2020 highlighted the frailty of our existing drinking water supply infrastructure. We know now that in the worst case drought scenario, we can go from full dams to draining our rain-fed water supplies within 4 years. And given the lead time needed to build new assets, now is the time to plan for a more resilient future. Changing climate conditions and expected population growth also mean that Sydney needs to confront the security of our drinking water supply and do so in a way that considers not just where that growth is happening, but how to solve for some of the other water-related challenges facing Sydney: urban heat, stormwater, wastewater, the health of our rivers, and the cost and energy implications of building and operating different water infrastructure solutions. The draft Greater Sydney Water Strategy puts all options, including recycled drinking water, on the table. So today we're here to discuss how to respond to these challenges and make policy and investment decisions that create a secure, healthy and net zero water supply, enhance recycled water usage and cool our warming city, and meet the needs of our diverse Sydney communities and stakeholders along the way. No small challenge. Let me introduce the four speakers. Firstly, we have Ashraf El-Sherbini. He's the Director of Resilient Cities and Towns in the Water Group of the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. Ashraf is leading the development of the Greater Sydney Water Strategy. Paul Higham is the Head of Strategy and Enterprise Planning at Sydney Water. Paul is joining for Maryanne Graham, who's unfortunately unwell this morning. Paul has 25 years experience in the water industry in the UK and Australia. Paul spent the last 10 years working on Sydney Water's strategic directions and asset strategies. Stuart is the Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of New South Wales and the Director of the newly established Australian Graduate School of Engineering. Stuart advises local, state and national government on their water strategies and has published over 170 peer-reviewed journal articles. And Craig Bush is the Waterways team leader at Blacktown City Council. Craig leads part of the implementation of Blacktown City Council's integrated water strategy, which covers the management of water in all its forms, including potable, wastewater, recycled water and stormwater. Welcome all of you and thank you again for joining us today, being part of this really exciting panel discussion. Ash, let me first hand over to you to kick off with an overview of the draft Greater Sydney Water Strategy, the underlying drivers, opportunities and possible pathways forward to secure Sydney's water supply and address some of the other growing challenges facing Sydney. Thank you, Ash.
Thank you, Sam. Good morning, everyone. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on Darug land and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and then extend that to any Aboriginal people here today. So what role does water play in maintaining Sydney's status as one of the most livable and productive cities in the world? That's essentially the question that the Greater Sydney Water Strategy is aimed at answering. The strategy sets the long-term vision and direction for water management over the next 20 years. And its objectives really are to support the economic growth and community well-being of the city, and to do that by making sure that we've got a secure and resilient water supply to meet the needs of growth, as well as adapt to a changing climate. We also want to make sure that we're supporting the delivery of the Greater Sydney Region Plan and the Premier's priorities for cooling and greening Greater Sydney. And importantly, the strategy identifies strategic pathways for decision making, and we're consulting with the community to make sure that we're delivering services that best meet the needs of the community and doing so in the most affordable way. To do that, there are 5 key challenges that we address. Firstly, to service our growing population. Greater Sydney is home to 5 million people, and that's expected to increase by another million over the next 15 years. Secondly, we need to build resilience to drought and climate change. As Sam mentioned earlier, we've learned from the most recent drought that we need to prepare for droughts before they begin, and we can expect future droughts to be more severe than what we've previously experienced. We also know that we can expect more floods at the same time as the climate becomes more variable. The third challenge is to support the economy and jobs. Greater Sydney accounts for around 70% of the state's economic activity and around a quarter of Australia's economy. So water is at the heart of our economy, and it's essential that we support businesses and jobs across Greater Sydney with a secure water supply. The fourth challenge is to put water at the heart of our city and communities. We need to get better at integrating land use and development planning and how we manage water in the landscape to improve livability and amenity. And the fifth challenge is to improve water management outcomes for Aboriginal people. We recognise that water is deeply entwined with Aboriginal culture, health and well-being. And while engagement with Aboriginal people around water management is improving, we acknowledge that more needs to be done. So obviously the strategy is quite comprehensive. I just wanted to introduce the kind of scope of the challenges that we address, but for the purpose of our time this morning, I won't be able to cover all of it, but I'd like to focus on 3 key ideas to really spark the conversation later on, as well as complement what the other speakers have to say. The first idea is that we need to plan differently for the future. The way we've traditionally planned for water security has too much risk and uncertainty inherent within it. And we need to take a different approach that aligns with government and the community's expectations around the level of risk that we're willing to take during drought. The second is to propose that right now, with our dams full, as Sam said, we're at 100% at Warragamba. Right now is the best time to take some concrete steps to increase our water resilience. Specifically, those steps are to increase investment in water efficiency and to begin planning for a portfolio of infrastructure that is needed both to support growth in the long term, but also so that we've got security for the next drought before the next drought comes around. Thirdly, in addition to increasing our robustness in the system, we need to be more adaptive. And we need to do that by making sure that we're managing our operational levers as well as we can. We're identifying what those are and maintaining flexibility within them, but also that we are monitoring the conditions that around climate change, growth, consumer demand, and patterns of development to understand which pathway we're heading upon and adjusting accordingly. So the first idea, why do we need to plan differently? The last drought provided a number of really useful lessons which have informed the way that we've gone about developing the Greater Sydney Water Strategy. The way we've traditionally planned for water security is using a probabilistic approach of different climatic conditions. Put simply, we plan for average conditions and we develop triggers for contingency planning during a drought. This approach meant that we were really exposed in the last drought because it was more severe than what we had previously contemplated under the 2017 Metropolitan Water Plan. The timeframes we thought we'd have to build the next piece of infrastructure were almost halved because of the rate of depletion we were experiencing in our dams, and that left us exposed. As you can see from the chart, in the Millennium Drought, our dam levels dropped by 50% in 4 years, whereas in the most recent drought, it took just 2.5 years to get that same reduction in water levels. So that rate of depletion, approximately 20% per annum, is the fastest rate of depletion we've experienced since our instrumental records began. What this meant is that if the drought had continued for another 2 years, it's unlikely we would have been able to build the required infrastructure in time to avoid putting the city into severe water restrictions or even facing the prospect of running out of water. And that's not a prospect that Sydney should ever face because of the dire social, environmental and economic impacts it could have. This challenge is exacerbated by the fact that only 15% of our water supply is met through rainfall independent supply. So rainfall independent supplies being desalination or purified recycled water. The only source that we have at the moment is the Sydney desalination plant, which only provides 15%, as I mentioned, and the rest comes from our dams, which is obviously dependent on rainfall. So to enhance our resilience, what we're proposing in this strategy is a new approach to thinking about future water needs, referred to as an enduring level of supply. Basically, it's a level of demand that we can be confident of supplying, even during a severe and prolonged drought, through rainfall independent sources. Ideally, this enduring level of supply would match the level of demand that the community could tolerate for a long period of time after water restrictions have reduced demand as much as possible. And this level of water supply needs to meet all segments of the economy, the needs of all those segments, to make sure that we've got the right economic, social, environmental and health outcomes. So to put it simply, what I'm talking about is if we go into a prolonged and severe drought and it stops raining for a really long time, we need to have enough rainfall independent supply through desalination or purified recycled water to keep the city going. And I want to stress that the strategy doesn't propose, and I'm not talking about building all the infrastructure we need up front. What this planning approach puts forward is building a portfolio that would be able to deliver that if and when it's needed, identifying the timeframes when you would need to make those investments in a responsible manner, and making sure that you've done the planning in advance so that those investments can be delivered in time. This brings me to the second key idea, just the one before, thanks Anna. This brings me to the second key idea, which is that we need to take some actions now while our dams are full. As Sam mentioned, having full dams means that we have at least 4 to 5 years of secure water supply, even if we entered into a drought now. This is the perfect opportunity to take the meaningful steps to increase our resilience. We know that our water system is at a tipping point. Our modelling shows that we need between 40 and 70 billion litres if we experience a mid-case demand. And that's effectively on the chart here. It's the difference between the red line and the blue line sloping up. That's the difference that we want to start making up now while our dams are full. And in addition to that gap, we also know that to support the greening and cooling objectives across the city, we'll need another 68 billion litres per year by 2035. So the shaded portions on this chart show the contribution from a range of proposed actions that could respond to these challenges. The first is to significantly increase investment in a comprehensive water conservation program aimed at saving up to 49 billion litres of water per year by 2040. So that's the blue portion that builds there. And the reason it builds is because water efficiency and conservation starts small and then has a cumulative benefit over the long run. So what we're proposing is, rather than waiting for a drought to invest in water efficiency, that's something that we should be investing in regardless of dam levels. And we should be making the most of every drop that we have before we invest in additional infrastructure. The second thing we propose is to change the way that we operate the existing Sydney desalination plant. Currently, the desal plant only operates as a drought response, or if there are certain shocks in the system that mean it's required for water quality or maintenance reasons. But effectively, we're not maximizing the benefit of having that asset as part of our system and already paying for the fixed cost of it being there when it's shut. So what we're proposing is to change the operating rules to increase the contribution from the Sydney desalination plant by up to 20 billion litres a year to help us make up that gap and enhance our resilience. But importantly, even after investing in water conservation and making the most of what we've got, the widening gap between demand and supply and the need to increase our drought resilience and that level of rainfall independent supply that I mentioned before is only at 15%. That all means that we need a new source of rainfall independent supply in the next 5 to 10 years to maintain our water security. To deliver this, we're looking at developing a portfolio in consultation with the community and ensuring that we have options that can be delivered before we reach critical dam levels in a drought. And given the clear need for additional rainfall independent supply, we want to make sure that all options are on the table, including purified recycled water. So the strategy takes a significant step forward in putting purified recycled water on the table as an option for consulting with the community about how and when it's best implemented. And as part of that journey, Sydney Water, it will invest in a demonstration plant for purified recycled water and continue engaging with the community about the effectiveness of the technology. And in addition to all of this, we also want to make greater use of stormwater and non-drinking recycled water to contribute to cooling and greening the city and supporting the recreational activities as well. Having said all of this, we are adopting an adaptive and flexible planning approach because we know that climate change and a range of other factors could result in changes to our assumptions, which brings me to the next key message of why we need to remain adaptive. Again, the learnings from the past drought demonstrated that having fixed triggers in the previous Metropolitan Water Plan left us exposed because we experienced a drought that was worse than what we forecast. And if we stuck to the plan, we would have run out of time. So we are making sure in the strategy that we've got more flexible operational levers and that we're monitoring conditions on an ongoing basis. So the chart on the left of your screen shows that over the past 30 years, average inflows to Sydney's dams have been half the long-term average since our records began. And at that same time, we've experienced significant floods. The chart on the right of the screen shows the demand and supply projections that we've used to inform the strategy. We modeled over 40 potential demand scenarios, which is the range shaded in light blue. And as you can see, that there's a huge range of potential forecasts. And while we've identified the actions that I mentioned before to progress in the short term, we acknowledge that there's a degree of uncertainty around the future, particularly the further out that you plan for. So we want to make sure that we've got a pathway that is adaptive for decision making. And in order to do that, we want to monitor key changes around water demand, customer behaviours, economic conditions, technology, climate change, and urban development. And we want to make sure that we continue to look back to see what's working and what's not. So what can you do? Well, governments can't address all of these challenges alone. As water users, as businesses, and as leaders in the community, you can all shape the type of water future we have in Sydney. We're keen to hear your ideas and suggestions. The formal consultation process on the draft strategy is now closed, but I'm very happy to receive any ideas or suggestions at any time that support maintaining Sydney's water resilience. So in closing, I'll leave you with this. Greater Sydney has been very well served by its water supply network to date, but our learnings from the last drought confirm that now is our opportunity to take a number of actions to increase our resilience to the growth and changing climate that we're already facing today and will continue to face. These actions need to be based on making the best use of every drop of water and optimizing the operation of our assets, and on increasing the share of rainfall independent supplies in our system so that we can begin the adaptive pathway towards an enduring level of supply that gives us a degree of security under any future scenario. To achieve this, we are planning differently, we are taking action now, and we will remain adaptive. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ash. That's great, and really great to hear that both resilience thinking and resilience language kind of embedded through through the strategy, the robustness, the flexibility, the adaptive pathways. And from a strategy perspective, that's obviously critical given, you know, the changing data and changing scenarios that you've had and how much you've learnt since the 2017 strategy. I guess that's a perfect setup for Paul to tell us about how you actually, as the utility responsible for actually delivering much of this infrastructure and much of these plans, how do you take those adaptive planning pathways or that resilience thinking and put that into practice in the context of all the challenges we've just highlighted? Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Sam. And firstly, I'd like to thank the committee, Sam and Anna, for the real opportunity now to talk about resilience. I think it's a brilliant timing to go through this, and we're really proud to sponsor the Committee for Sydney on this resilience programme. We believe that this could be the start of many conversations that will only benefit our customers and our communities for the future. So I'd firstly like to start off with an acknowledgement. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we work, live and learn. We pay our respects to elders past and present. I'm on Parramatta land today in Parramatta, and obviously they have a wonderful relationship with the waterways around the Parramatta River and Sydney Harbour. And we really can learn from those communities about how we make the city more resilient. And it is a cornerstone for how we need to think about planning for our infrastructure for the future. I seem to have lost the slides, Anna. Thank you. So really, what is important is to think about some of the decisions that we will need to make in the next couple of years. The decisions that we will make in the next 5 years will have influence for the generations to come. And it really is important for us to not only think about the infrastructure we will build, but what the community aspirations are and how they can be core to the decisions that we make. There are a number of key decisions that will influence the livability and economic success of the city for future generations, and really taking that on board. We know from experience that everybody knows what Sydney Water does. You know, you turn on the tap and water comes out, you have a shower and water drains away. And that is our core business. But actually, thinking about the future and the role that we want to play in supporting the future is going to be paramount about how we unlock the potential for livable communities, how we think about the green spaces and the environment that we create as our city starts to expand to the west, and as we start to experience urban densification as our city grows. Our vision is to create a better life with world-class water services. And yes, we do service 5 million customers today, but as Ash alluded to, that is going to be 6 million in the middle of the next century, and onwards and upwards to 8 million in 2050, and obviously grow beyond that. We really need to understand how we can unlock the potential for achieving the New South Wales government's vision around the metropolis of 3 cities. And also not forget about the 4th city, which is the Illawarra coastal city in our area of operation. So really planning for what does it mean to have an integrated approach to water and wastewater services for the long run. And we need to navigate some really critical challenges in this. 2 of the main ones that Ash has already alluded to is climate change and the growing population. So I like to explore those a little bit further as we go, and actually give some insight into the opportunities that are in front of us. Climate change, well, we have experienced the ups and downs of climate change in the last few years. You know, we've experienced, as Ash showed, the most intense drought period that our records have shown. We've also seen Warragamba Dam spill in the same period against the backdrop of bushfires. So the whole environment in which we're operating is seeing increasing variability, and it's no longer appropriate to plan on the average of averages. So actually really need to think about that climate variability and what that's going to do, and also how that impacts on our ability to sustain a green, cool environment for our city. Population growth, 8 million people by 2056, will put increasing pressure on our rainfall dependent sources and our system and how we integrate into that. And we've estimated that we will need at least 120 billion litres to service that population growth in the short term. Climate change isn't just about volume though. I mean, it does change the characteristics of our water bodies and our dams. So longer periods of dry weather increases the resilience risk associated with algal blooms. Intense rainfall would see greater catchment inflows, as we have experienced over the last 12 months, 2 years, which actually impacts the quality of the water in those dams and the ability to actually treat that water in the long run as that climate change starts to impact it. Potential disruption to electricity supplies and what that means through intense storms and how we service the city. And then if you think about our wastewater system and the threat of higher sea levels, you know, low-lying coastal assets will come under increasing pressure, and actually how we think about that. And we may see increasing failures of pipes and sewers as the soil structures start to change. So we really need to plan for this more resilient future and how we can bring that to life as we move forward. So what are we thinking about? We're looking at a range of water supply options for the future. And Ash has explained earlier, looking at water conservation as being critical for the long-term sustainability of our city, and working with our communities to use water wisely and be efficient in the use of that water. Unlocking the potential of stormwater harvesting and recycled water for non-drinking purposes to keep our city cool and green and more resilient to these climate stresses that we observe. Exploring the opportunities for rainfall independent water sources such as purified recycled water and desalination expansion. And also considering, well, are there opportunities to make better use and better construct infrastructure to service the dams and the rainfall independent opportunities. But we're also looking at the resilience of the interconnectivity of our systems between the Prospect system and the Southern Dam systems, and actually how can we make sure that we can have water where we need it, when we need it, for as much as we need. So looking at those range of opportunities as we go forward. So we recently did some work with our communities to understand their preferences. We surveyed just over 1,800 people through this work and looked at providing the information on the various supply options. And when we talked to the community about desalination, at the start of the forums, 75% of customers were supportive of that as an option. But in dialogue with the community, understanding that they are costly to build, costly to operate, high energy users, and have an environmental impact. During the course of that conversation, support reduced, only marginally, but support did reduce in that conversation, and kind of give us a real feel for what our community is looking for. We also talked to them about purified recycled water as an opportunity for the future. And this one indeed changed during the course of the conversation from 69%, which was quite a high starting point when we talked about this factor. But with a bit more information around actually it's a lower cost than desal, it reduces the amount of environmental impact from wastewater treatment. Actually, community support grew, and we understood from this process that education is going to be critical to the long-term sustainability and resilience of our system. So making sure that we are engaging on a regular basis with our communities to really understand their aspirations and opportunities. And as we've seen over the time, over the last 12 months, we've been engaging broadly around purified recycled water to understand the aspirations of the community. And as you can see, over time, as people start to understand the challenges that our city faces, the consideration for purified recycled water is improving, and greater numbers of people are supportive of it as an idea for the community. And also a greater number, as you can see there's over 70% of people are likely to drink it or consider it as a maybe, and be able to take on the information as we can communicate with the community. So a growing trend and a growing acceptance of having a more resilient and more sustainable supply for our city is going to be a real opportunity. Now, within these numbers, there are areas where we will need to provide greater education on the process. So, for example, females are less likely than males to think it is a supportive of the idea. Females with families equally would need to be understood their concerns and their aspirations for the future. Non-English speaking or language other than English communities would also need to have an engagement process to ensure that they understand the opportunity and what the challenges faced over that. So we expect to be able to work with the communities and have dialogue with them to understand their opportunities, and making sure that we can reassure them of all options are equally safe and provide drinkable, sustainable water for all our needs for our city as we go forward. And building that confidence is going to be fundamental for the future. So it is really important that it's not just one solution that's going to be considered. It has to be a range of solutions. And it's actually thinking about how we can meet not just the basic needs of the city, but have affordable services that help support the economic growth of our city. It's about understanding that we need adequate water for drinking, but also that sustainable water supply for the urban cooling as our city expands. We need to think beyond the traditional water cycle and think about the investment decisions that will embed resilience in our system. As Ash was indicating earlier, the resilience of both drought scenarios and flood scenarios is going to be really important as we build our future system, and how we actually embed a more rainfall independent approach to our city and actually becoming more resilient. And diversity will be key in that conversation. A lot of the learnings that we've got is a bit like your share portfolios. You don't invest in one share, you invest in a diversified portfolio of options that allow you to manage the risk and exposure for the future. We have identified that purified recycled water has the potential to achieve 25% of the city's water supply by 2056. It is less energy intensive, and as a result supports net carbon neutral outcomes as we go forward. And as I said earlier, it also allows us to enhance the performance of our waterways into the future. We will continue to engage with our communities, make sure that they are on the journey with us, and make sure that they provide the feedback and input that's necessary to shape the views and opinions and the decisions that will be made as we move forward. But it isn't just about the traditional thinking. It isn't just about the traditional thinking about water supply. As we move to the west, we will see large greenfield developments, and understanding how we can play a greater role in the sustainability aspirations of the city. We are currently have the Upper South Creek Advanced Water Recycling Centre. Its EIS is currently out for consultation. It actually closes tomorrow. But that scheme will be the largest resilience investment that Sydney Water will have made in the last decade. And we're looking at those opportunities about how we can maximise the value of this facility for water, wastewater, and for energy in the future. So actually becoming a real hub of sustainability to support the aspirations of Western Sydney and the parklands that surround it. It will provide high quality recycled water for environmental flows and for industrial and residential usage. It will also look at how we can support anaerobic digestion to support greater circularity in solutions for our economy. Clearly anaerobic digestion is core activity for us as a wastewater utility, but it actually has a broader opportunity that will enable us to produce renewable energy and unlock the potential of the circular economy as we move forward. Making places more livable is going to be fundamental. Last year, we commissioned some work in support of the Western City Parkland aspirations around urban typologies and stormwater management. And we published those reports on our website, and they are accessible to all. But it really looks at a range of urban development configurations that allow you to maintain the urban densities of the city whilst also unlocking the potential of blue-green spaces. The work we did has identified the potential to reduce stormwater runoff by up to 75% in order to meet the objectives of waterway health. But as you can imagine, in capturing that stormwater runoff, the opportunity that unlocks around urban greening and cooling is quite significant. And obviously the urban, changing the influence of urban heat island effect is also going to be significant as we move forward. So really encourage, if you do have the opportunity and interested, to look at our urban typologies work online, because it is a really interesting read and could set a new direction for how we develop these communities. So just to expand a little bit on that, in terms of what does the urban typology work talk about? It talks about the ability to actually realise the potential for 3.5 times the urban tree canopy cover through greening and resilience of the water supply. The potential to increase open space by between 8 and 14%, depending on the area that it's planned for. The potential to reduce peak temperatures by nearly 5 degrees on those extremely hot days. So that will become increasingly important as we move forward. And the potential to actually change the way we think about pervious services and controlling urban runoff. You know, really understanding how we can manage those challenges that will increase as we move further and further west into the parkland city. So real opportunity to think differently and unlock the potential for the future. I've already mentioned renewable energy once. One of the things that is really important, Sydney Water are one of the largest users of energy in New South Wales. The movement of water and wastewater around the city is a significant demand on wastewater. And equally, water is a significant driver for the production of energy. So it is a water energy nexus that we are looking at. Sydney Water already produces approximately 20% of its energy through solar, hydro and cogeneration, but we know that there's an opportunity to do more. We know that we can look at water, energy efficiency and enhancing our renewable energy aspirations, but more importantly is looking at the opportunities that come with biogas. We use the equivalent energy to nearly 72,000 homes a year, so anything that we can do will have a significant impact for our city. And indeed, the biogas presents a new opportunity for us to think differently about how we can do that. We've recently partnered with Gemini to explore Australia's first biogas to grid scheme that will allow us to treat the biogas from anaerobic digestion and inject that back into the gas grid as a green gas in lieu of replacement of fossil fuels in that space. We have 11 sites that have anaerobic digestion on them, so we're exploring the opportunity to see what that means. Malabar alone, the scheme at Malabar alone, will provide enough gas to service 6,300 homes. So actually thinking about this as a long-term potential as we unlock our circular economy approach. I'm also really pleased to be able to communicate today that we are committed to carbon neutrality by 2030 for our existing operations and working towards neutrality in our supply chain by 2040. That will work with best practice energy performance and changing the way that we think about our investments in our operational activities and capital investment activities. Also looking at how the energy market is driven and the willingness of our communities to actually reduce their emissions. So we can support through our water conservation activities, for example, the ability for our community to influence the long-term carbon usage in the city, but also thinking about green energy and how we can actually procure that and the willingness to pay those tariffs as we go forward as the energy market evolves and we transition from a coal-based future to a renewable energy-based future. So it's a really exciting time that allows us to unlock the potential of the circular economy. So I'd just like to end with the fact that the role of Sydney Water as a service provider will always be there, but our role in unlocking the potential for this city is changing. How we think about how we plan land use, water, and the circular economy is going to be a real potential for unlocking the potential of resilience in our city, and actually how we can have a long-term vision of how water can enable a water-sensitive city that is cool, green, sustainable for the long term, and ensure that Sydney remains one of the global cities for development and economic purposes in the long run. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. That was super comprehensive, and I guess gives us an insight into the complexity of, as you say, what sits behind turning on taps and turning on showers, and where the water comes from and where it goes to, and how you can kind of shape that operational process and that investment process to respond not just to changing climate in terms of floods and bushfires and those kinds of impacts on the kind of water quality and water supply, but also actually how you increase the circularity and reduce the carbon intensity of that development and deliver the community outcomes. So it's fascinating kind of insight there, and yeah, really great to hear again that kind of that resilience thinking kind of embedded in the way you're approaching both now and in the future. Stuart, I'm going to hand over to Stuart Khan now to give us another perspective, the research perspective, I guess, or another perspective on partly what we can do here and what we need to push, but also what's happening around the world, and how we can think about this a little bit differently.
Thanks, Sam. You can see that presentation, I assume? So great. So I'm going to build on a few of the things that you've already heard about and talk in a little bit more detail about some of the opportunities that we have, particularly around this issue that Ash introduced of rainfall independent supplies. So to me, this is the big innovation in the draft Greater Sydney Water Strategy, is the introduction of this idea about how rainfall independent supplies are an objective in themselves. So as Ash described previously, we would think about sustainable yields from our dams, from our water supplies, and those sustainable yields would really be averaged over a longer term. But then we realised that it's not much good to have a reliable yield from a dam on average. And if that average means 3 years of drought followed by a year of flooding, which is pretty familiar to all of us here in Sydney. So there's a problem with that. So the idea that you would introduce rainfall independent supplies is to buffer that situation so that we can get through periods where the rainfall is not going to be reliable for short periods of time, and we have alternative parts of that portfolio, as Paul described, that we can bring water in from. And when you look at the draft Greater Sydney Water Strategy, when it starts to talk about rainfall independent supplies, one of the things it does is that it points out that Sydney has a low level of rainfall independent supplies compared to another of other cities around Australia. And so we might start to think about where's the right benchmark, where's the right level of rainfall independent supplies to try to target. And I think that's why it has been identified that as we bring new sources of water on in Sydney, this is an objective that we need to be ticking the box as well for. Many of these supplies have other advantages that are quickly alluded to in this text as well, in that they can help buffer the system against all sorts of shocks and outages and disruptions. So it really is a way of introducing resilience into the system. And there are lots of different ways that you could think about rainfall independent supplies. In some cities, a very, very large sustainable groundwater system might be a rainfall independent supply. Obviously, groundwater is connected to surface water, is connected to rainfall, but in some cases where that resource is large enough, we could think about being somewhat separated to that rainfall dependence. In Sydney, though, as Ash said, we're primarily going to be thinking about seawater desalination and different approaches to water recycling. A couple of years ago, I did some work for ATSE, the Academy of Technology and of Technological Sciences and Engineering, around water recycling. And as a subcomponent of that research, we engaged GHD to come up with this conceptual idea of trying to look at the costs and the benefits of some of these. It's not a real city, it's a completely made up city with made up geography, but to think about how might we fit in different approaches to providing what we would now call rainfall independent supplies of water. So they looked at seawater desalination, they looked at indirect potable reuse, direct potable reuse, and they looked at purple pipe schemes, local dual pipe schemes, all with these different concepts about how far you would need to transport water. If you're going right back up to a reservoir, 100 kilometers inland, or if you're going directly into the drinking water supply, maybe 25 kilometers inland, or if you're using water more locally through a dual pipe scheme, the different configurations that we could consider. Obviously, there's an infinite number, but this was a way of trying to get a little bit of benchmarking for what the key contributors to the costs might be in some of these cases. So I'll just show you this one slide with some results, which I think point to where the opportunities are. So if we look at energy first over here, they were able to divide up the energy contributions from a seawater reverse osmosis plant to look at down here, the red is the raw water intake, pumping it up from the ocean. The brownie color here is the energy requirements for production to actually treat the water. And then the blue box on the top is the distribution. Obviously, the distribution will change significantly depending on how far you want to pump that water from where it's produced. So that blue box is potentially highly variable. But the brown box, putting aside technology improvements, gradual technology improvements, the brown box is pretty much set. This is what it will cost to produce a megaliter of water, 3,500 kilowatt hours to produce a megaliter of drinking water via seawater desalination. But if we look at the recycling schemes, indirect potable reuse and direct potable reuse, the energy requirements for producing that water are much lower. And that's where the benefit often lies. And you can look at that energy with dollar signs, or you can look at that energy with a carbon footprint. But the energy to produce the water is decreased. The blue box, however, can be highly variable. It really comes down to system design. This is how far you need to pump the water after it's treated. If you're going to talk about pumping water from Malabar Sewage Treatment Plant up to Warragamba Dam, then the blue box is going to be off the scale of this chart. So there's no set rule that one is more energy intensive than the other. It is about system design. But if you can design your system so that you don't have to pump water long distances, and the direct potable reuse option really brings that one home, then you can end up saving a lot of energy, saving greenhouse footprint, saving carbon emissions, saving dollars, operational costs as a consequence. Here they have the dual pipe system, the purple pipe dual reticulation scheme. Big savings on treatment processes there, because we don't need to bring that up to a drinking water standard, and also relatively small costs on water distribution, because these are local schemes. We're not pumping hundreds of kilometers. However, when we start to look at the materials investment, that's where the dual pipe systems start to become more difficult, because we've got large amounts of steel or whatever materials we would use, but large amounts of pipage to distribute that water to every single property in some cases. Because we're not allowing it to mingle with the drinking water supply. So we need a whole separate reticulation scheme. And it's also often the difference between indirect potable reuse and some of the others, seawater reverse osmosis and DPR, where we have the opportunity to take the water where we treat it, where we produce it, and put it back into the supply system relatively locally. Often with indirect potable reuse, we're looking to get right back up into the supply, into the main reservoir. And that's where those additional materials come into play. Obviously, there are many more considerations as well. Land availability, how would you actually build some of these pipelines? They'd have to be underground. So there's a lot more to think about. But these are some of the key drivers for why, in certain circumstances, the portfolio of solutions might look different in one city to another. All of these solutions have a role to play. They all exist. hence at the right place, they all make sense. But in different places, I think we'll find that the advantages and the disadvantages do vary. So just to have a look at some of the water recycling schemes that have been constructed around Australia, just two of them, or two or three of them, we'll have a quick look at. So the most well established and the best known is the Groundwater Replenishment Scheme, which was constructed in Perth and started operating in 2017. It's a pretty small scheme, 40 megalitres per day. It treats taking water from a wastewater treatment plant to the north of Perth, the Beanyip wastewater treatment plant, and then treating that through membrane treatment processes and ultraviolet disinfection before putting that back down into their groundwater supply, the Leederville aquifer and the Nangara aquifer. These are important drinking water aquifers. They already produce drinking water from, so they're recharging those aquifers, which has a number of advantages in their case. But that opportunity doesn't really apply to Sydney because we don't rely at all really on groundwater for drinking water supply. In Perth, it's been very successful. They're now doubling the size of that scheme to 80 megs per day. That's currently undergoing commissioning and will be in operation, I think, probably pretty early next year. And in the longer term, they expect to be able to provide more than 300 megalitres per day by groundwater replenishment from purified recycled water. The other big scheme was constructed in southeast Queensland, the Western Corridor Recycled Water Scheme, which Brisbane's drinking water supply looks a bit more like Sydney's, a big reliance on a big surface water supply, Wivenhoe Dam, Lake Wivenhoe. And they have constructed this scheme where they now can take water from 6 different wastewater treatment plants. It's delivered to 3 advanced water treatment plants, Bundamba, Luggage Point and Gibson Island, as mentioned here. And that recycled water is available for a number of uses. Some of it from Luggage Point is currently being used as a water supply to gas-fired power station and a couple of other small industrial users. A large components of this plant, two of these plants are actually decommissioned at the moment. They're not operating, but they're there and they're part of Southeast Queensland's water strategy, and there are trigger points when they're agreed to actually get that plant recommissioned and providing water back into Lake Wivenhoe. So it is actually part of Southeast Queensland's water security at the moment, because they are in the plan, and there is a time when supplies drop to low levels that scheme will be recommissioned, and purified recycled water will be supplying Lake Wivenhoe as part of their drinking water supply. And there's another approach to water recycling that we refer to as de facto water reuse. And that's a purified water recycling scheme that may not have a piece of paper from the City Hall, so to speak, to say that it's a purified recycled water scheme, but it is what it is. And in this case, the replacement flows project in Western Sydney has been a successful and important project for Sydney Water, where they take water from 3 wastewater treatment plants, Penrith, St Mary's, Quakers Hill. All of that water gets shipped to St Mary's, where it undergoes the same purified water recycling process through reverse osmosis membrane filtration to produce very high quality water, which is then delivered back into the Nepean River. And the Nepean River flows about 15, 16 kilometres downstream to get to the North Richmond water filtration plant and becomes part of the drinking water supply in North Richmond. That's a very, very common situation. Every city that is on a river pretty much has some aspect of de facto water recycling going on, where usually nowhere near to the degree of the same water quality and management as we have here. This is exceptional, having the membrane treatment processes. Normally, it's about treated effluent, conventionally treated wastewater effluent going into streams, which become part of drinking water supplies for communities downstream. So these are all important ways of recycling water, and they all enhance the reliability of the drinking water system as a whole. In Australia, we have well-established drinking water guidelines, and we have guidelines that have been specifically developed to make sure that when people are designing purified recycled water schemes, that we know what best practice is and we know how to meet that, and we know how to ensure that we will provide very, very high quality, safe drinking water. And it's also reassuring that there are guidelines that have been produced by the World Health Organization for potable reuse now, and they follow very much the same principles as we see in the Australian documents. So Australia is really at the front of making sure that we can do proper risk management, high quality, high safety, purified recycled water. The other key issue, of course, is around community perspectives, public acceptance. And we've learned a lot of lessons, many of them from Perth, many of them internationally. So some of the key lessons that we've learned are that customer engagement is crucial. You can't spring a purified recycled water scheme onto people. You need to engage them in the process of planning, and it's a long, perhaps 10-year conversation. So customer engagement needs to start well in advance of any reuse scheme starting. Need to consider starting the engagement work during the good times when the dams are full, as we've already heard today. And a tried and true successful strategy in undertaking that engagement is through the use of visitor centres, allowing people to come in and learn about the technologies, the concepts behind water recycling, to see the water, to see the treatment processes, builds trust and understanding for recycled water. And the last important point I think I'd like to make is you really need support from politicians, and that's what makes or breaks projects. When you look at the successes and the failures, if you've got political parties trying to take cheap shots or opportunities for scare campaigns, that's unfortunately a very easy thing to do, and it derails important projects. Now we seem to be in a situation in New South Wales where we have a lot of cooperation and a lot of goodwill about wanting to see these sorts of projects progress, and make this point that I think you can see me in the background of this picture talking to the Water Minister. I went in with a couple of people from the Water Services Association, Daniel Francis and Adam Lovell, to New South Wales Parliament a few years ago, spoke to the Nationals party room, which is where the Water Minister is. And it was a lot of goodwill, being able to come in and demonstrate what we've learned, being able to put reports in front of the politicians about water recycling and what we've learned from other lessons from other cities, being able to bring in samples of recycled water, enabling them to ask questions and being able to answer those questions, I think built trust, and it built some degree of confidence among the politicians that this is something that they can talk about. And the next day, one of the MLCs, Wes Fang, put this up on his Facebook page. The last line being, given the information delivered to us today, along with the samples provided, I'm more than happy to accept recycled water as one of the solutions for our current water issues. And to me, that's what matters. It's leadership, and it's about the politicians saying, this is something that we can do, and we have faith in it, we trust it, and we support moving forward in this area. All right, that's all I have.
Thanks, Stuart. Clearly passionate about this this topic, and great to see both those two sides of it. The community engagement's obviously critical to the acceptance, but actually you need the political leadership and the political acceptance. So doing it at that level and kind of having all of those sort of case studies and technology behind the processes and where they worked before, but actually people have got to get on board with it. So perfect segue into Craig Bush from Blacktown City Council, who's going to talk about that place perspective. So what does this look like in place? What is, we've talked about a big integrated, metropolitan water strategy and all the different ways that can play out. What does that look like in place, Craig?
G'day everyone. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Darug people who are the traditional owners of the land on which I work and live. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their custodianship of the land and the waters. And next slide. First of all, just a little bit of context for Blacktown. As you may all well be aware, we're the largest council in New South Wales by population, with over 400,000 residents, growing to over 440,000 in the next 20 odd years. So a significant increase. Majority of that is from greenfield development in our north of the LGA, which is around the Marsden Park, Schofield, Riverstone areas. And as you see in the photo below, there's a clear example of an area in Marsden Park that's under extensive development at the moment. And this is going to be the norm in the north of the LGA. And obviously Blacktown Council as well, it's got a very large diversity of community. So from nationalities to language to wealth. It's very diverse, and I guess that just it does complicate when you're trying to put messages across. You just have to make sure that you're catering for a very wide range of people. Yep, next slide. Okay, so I guess in Blacktown, but or more of a Western Sydney context, some of the major issues that we're going to be facing over the next 20 years is obviously urban heat. We're significantly growing our urban areas, and as part of that, we're minimising or reducing some of the existing canopy cover. And the developments that are occurring, it's quite restrictive in terms of actually being able to plant large trees back into that area. And also a lot of our parks, we're trying to improve canopy cover the best we can, but we also need to ensure that there's actually open space for the community to enjoy as well. Climate change is obviously going to be a key factor in that. So obviously the increased heat, there's going to be increased mortality rates. And another factor of climate change is to reduce the rainfall. So obviously that's going to put pressure on our potable water resources. And there's going to be increased intensity of rainfall. So when it does rain, it'll be quite intense, and that will increase the risk of flooding, especially the local and nuisance flooding that occurs already. And obviously with development, waterway health is bound to be impacted or at least stressed. So the increase of imperviousness means more stormwater, and which means likely a decline in waterway health. And also the increased population is obviously going to be an increase in recycled water or sewage that will also be discharged into our waterways as well. So as part of our strategy, or how we've started to think about how do we deal with water, Blacktown Council embarked on the integrated water strategy, which basically puts together a lot of councils' existing strategies and plans, such as the water saving action plans and other strategies like that, put them all into one place. So it's basically our strategic approach to how we manage water. So looking at exactly the potable water, how do we reduce that? But obviously, how do we also include stormwater and recycled water as in our water resources? The document's actually called 6 Streams. It's not talking about 6 creeks or 6 rivers. It's in the picture down the bottom right. There's 6 components of the strategy. Basically, looking at one of them being amenity and quality of life, another being hidden waterways, which refers to not just a waterway, but we've got the stormwater drainage network, but then there's also the larger waterways and rivers and ocean downstream that obviously sometimes gets lost as part of in some strategies. So climate and urban heat, servicing urban growth, which we've been talking about just previously. Affordability, we need to make sure that whatever we're implementing, it's affordable into the future, and to ensure that our community can afford those resources as well. And we're competitive. So competing against other places. So we want Blacktown to be a place where people want to come and live. So in the strategy, we've created some short and to medium term targets, so 2026 and then long term, and in trying to ensure all the efforts are coordinated to achieve those common goals. The strategy, so as I said, there was those 6 streams, but in total there's 8 targets that have both the medium and long term targets that we're working towards. Now, there's quite an extensive consultation process, both internally and externally, to get this strategy approved. Obviously, through council, there's obviously the different levels within council, and they were, we found they were quite supportive of what we're trying to do, to try and to create a strategy that sort of linked it all together and provide them a clear vision for the future. Our targets are quite ambitious, we feel, and we've actually set real targets to improve or increase by certain numbers, not just the standard. Oh, we want to improve or decrease. We actually set targets with actual figures to say this is where we need to be. If we wanted to achieve the vision, this is the numbers that we need to go to. And also, I guess the coordinated efforts that included how we needed to invest and to get the best return on investment. Because obviously, if we're using ratepayer funding, we do ensure we're using that funding as wisely as possible. And we've put in there within our council strategy, basically every 5 years, we'll review it and adjust it accordingly to ensure that we're still working towards that vision. So the vision is to become a water sensitive city. So if you look at the CRCs for water sensitive cities, a lot of the information that they've put out, we want to sort of work towards becoming a water sensitive city, which basically uses water in an efficient and smart way, recognises water can improve the local amenity and combat urban heat. We highly value our waterways. In Blacktown, we've got over 20 waterways and over 260 kilometres of waterways that we need to ensure that we manage appropriately, and we need the community to value them the best they can. And recognise the role of water in creating high quality open space, and the water being used to create vibrant precincts. So as part of the strategy, we developed this water balance model, which looks at all the inputs and outputs for water. So rainfall and drinking water is the main inputs, but then what actually happens once the water gets into our city. So the evaporation, stormwater, base flows, infiltration and sewage, and noting how that's going to change over the next 20 years to 2036. Next slide. And it shows the, just highlighted the bottom right is the main one, I guess, when you're looking at council's operations. We're going to be increasing our water use by potentially, over 60% over that period. And obviously the residents by more than 50%, and industrial, commercial and others are going to increase significantly, as well as, the amount of sewage that's going to be produced is potentially increasing by 50% as well. So there's some of the main takeaways, but obviously the way water within our city, how we use it and how we get it is going to change into the future. We need to make sure that we've planned appropriately for that and we make the most of our investments. As part of the strategy, so we've got the 8 targets, but we've also got, I believe it's 27 actions. So each target has a number of actions that we need to complete to show that we're moving towards those targets. 18 of them are currently basically our existing programs that we're just trying to make sure we're getting the most out of them and working towards those targets. So we don't need additional funding for them. They should be already within operational budgets. But there are some actions that require either grant funding or additional funding from other resources, just to ensure that we're moving towards those targets. And just briefly, I guess, when we're talking about potable water, I've indicated here a few things that I feel and the council feels that we need to potentially improve or work on to ensure that we're getting the most out of the potable water supply. So like today, we need to ensure we've got improved coordination between the state government agencies, Sydney Water and councils, to ensure we're all working together, because I feel there's in the past it probably hasn't happened to the best of its ability, but we need to ensure that everyone's at the table and we're all working together towards a common goal. Just one thing, a couple of other things. I guess one of my bugbears is for harvesting stormwater. I feel the state government potentially might need to change some of its legislation to make sure it's easier for councils to do so without going through the Water Management Act and applying for licenses and unit shares and all these sorts of things, especially in an urban area where our issue is too much stormwater. It's not that we don't have enough. We're trying to actually minimise the amount of stormwater that reaches our waterways and degrades it. We're actually trying to harvest it and use it, yet there's some limitations on what we can do. The community consultation has been discussed today, which has been great. Yes, there definitely needs to be improved consultation across the community. Increase some funding for how we can do some water saving projects, again, which we touched on again today. But it'd be great to see some long-term secure funding, not necessarily just grants, but actually providing councils with more ability to do so. And also some of the policies and legislations that are currently around can be strengthened to ensure that the community and business and industrial areas save water and try and use the other water sources such as rainwater and stormwater harvesting. And as a local government, we could obviously use more recycled water, stormwater, and rainwater. We just need to be strategic about how we implement it. And obviously trying to increase efficiencies in our community facilities and stuff like that, where we do use potable water, make sure that it goes the furthest it can. And to try and make sure we reduce the irrigation or try and make it more as efficient as possible. So what happens if we fail? Obviously there's budget implications. The more potable water we use, the more we have to spend. There's a decline in waterway health if we don't manage to capture and reuse that stormwater. There's community expectations about how we manage our waterway. So if we don't do it properly, then there's the community going to let us know. Reducing the ability to mitigate against urban heat, which is again one of the main factors, and also drought proofing to ensure that the community facilities, the sporting fields and stuff like that, that when we do go for a drought, they're not heavily impacted, which then impact the community. Making it be more resilient, so being again more strategic and making sure everything is cost effective as appropriate as possible, and making sure that we don't miss any opportunities to put Blacktown City as an economic and attractive place for people to live and invest in. And that's it.
Thank you, Craig. It's really helpful and insightful to get that kind of place perspective that you're talking about. And I think also to hear, at the start we heard Ash kind of talking about the big vision and kind of the pathways, I guess, to that adaptive management. And then hearing kind of at the other end of and sort of from Sydney Water, how, what that looks like in terms of the decision-making processes. And then hearing from you, Craig, kind of what does that look like on the ground? I guess to the audience, very welcome to turn your cameras on and ask questions, but please post your questions or put your hands up if you do have a question. I guess my first question to open us up, and as to Ash, you and Paul to start with, but also to everyone else, I guess, what does that implementation pathway look like? I mean, we heard from Stuart about, there being different trigger points that Queensland's kind of playing with around turning on their different assets that they've built. You've talked about, the need to make some of these decisions relatively quickly in terms of drinking water, but also there's a whole range of other investments that need to be made, through Sydney Water, through local government. What does that, I know you're still finalising the strategy. What does that, implementation look like? What does that next step look like to try and deliver this really impressive vision?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. So we've had over 800 responses to the draft strategy, which is fantastic. So we're going through that feedback at the moment, which also includes a lot of feedback, as Craig referred to, from local councils about how we can improve that integration between state and local government, because as you said, a lot of the outcomes are delivered through Sydney Water and through local councils. So we're working through that, and what we're hoping to do is in the final strategy have a very clear implementation plan that sets clear timeframes for and responsible parties for the actions that will deliver on this vision. So to take a couple of examples, so for water efficiency, for example, we have started ramping up that investment. Paul might want to add what Sydney Water is doing, but even within the department, we are identifying that sustainable funding stream that Craig mentioned is really important to make sure that this happens, particularly outside of drought, because to be honest, people forget about the issue of saving water when the dams are full. We want to make sure that the sustainable funding stream is such that this is happening regardless of the dam levels. So that's one. We're also creating a dedicated team to drive water efficiency strategies, not just in Greater Sydney, but across the whole state. That's part of our statewide water strategy commitments. So that's on water efficiency. Paul might want to add about what the portfolio of supply augmentation process looks like, but effectively, it's kind of over to Sydney Water to explore all the options along with that community feedback that Paul referred to, and recommend what that investment pathway looks like to government.
Thanks, Ash. So yeah, we're partnering with Ash and the team at the moment around the implementation plan to make sure that the actions are clear and have accountable persons for them. Building on Ash's point on water conservation, you'll have all hopefully seen the water conservation adverts that are on telly at the moment. It's really important to think about, water conservation is a behavior. It's not something you can turn on and off in an instant. So we're really trying to educate and work with the community to actually get the long-term benefits from water conservation programs and build those up. It isn't about changing washing machines and shower heads. Yes, they are important factors, but actually it's about user behavior most of the time. And actually ingraining that into the psyche of the city as we move forward. So we've started, even though the strategy isn't fully finalised, water conservation is going to play an increasing role in how we sustain for the future. In terms of supply augmentation, we are looking at a range of planning activities at the moment around that will allow us to compare all of the options. So the full suite of options, system interconnectivity, as well as desal, as well as recycle water, in order to make an informed decision around how quickly can you build it, what capacity can it bring, what does it look like. And we will be working alongside Ash and the team to actually explore those in detail. As we've alluded to, depending on climatic conditions and how the systems play out, the next augmentation will be needed in the 5 to 10 year window. We can't be exactly certain when it is at this moment in time, but the planning will make a recommendation in due course to say the next supply augmentation should be X and it needs to be delivered by Y, and that'll be part of the implementation planning as we move forward. So a lot of really good work going on in that space to explore the opportunities. The other thing that I will add here is it's not just solely about how much water and when do we need it. It's about actually thinking about land planning, land and urban planning. How do we actually integrate the water conversation fully and holistically in land and urban planning, such that you can get the place-based outcomes that you're seeking, and that if we can get some greater clarity around that, working in partnership with everybody who's on this committee, working in partnership, the more transparent we are with those decisions and requirements, then obviously you can plan accordingly for a range of diverse sources that will have multiple benefits for the city.
Great, Paul. And obviously working out how to price in some of those environmental and land use benefits and heat mitigation benefits in your business case, which is going to be another challenge.
Absolutely, Sam. And those, we can't understate those broader economic benefits. If you just think about urban cooling, if it's 10 degrees hotter in the west, how can you cool that down by 5 degrees? What's the benefit of doing that? Social, environmental, carbon, energy. There's a whole range of benefits, and making sure that those things are recognised is going to be really important.
Great. Stuart and Craig, if you have a thought, just put your hand up or jump in. But I'll call on Paul. I've got a question from Paul Hackney. Paul, did you want to jump on and ask that?
I just wondered why this most recent drought, the water supply went down a lot faster. I mean, lots of water conservation things have gone in the previous decade or two. So I was just wondering why that was the case.
I'm happy to start, and Paul, Stuart, feel free to jump in. There are a number of factors, but I think the strongest one is the fact that we had no net inflow into our dams over that entire period, pretty much. So it was the fact, and putting it simply, the drought was a lot worse, a lot more severe, in that when it did, the kind of little bits of rain we did get over that period weren't significant enough to actually result in inflows into the dams. So what you can see on that chart is effectively that when we did get rain, the dam depletion rates still maintained going down. So I think that's the biggest factor. But the other kind of factors that play into it are that water conservation, whilst there were some programs running, it wasn't as significant as it was during the Millennium Drought. This is one of the learnings that we had, is during the Millennium Drought, there was significant investment in water conservation and efficiency. And at the end of the drought, when the problems went away, our investment really decreased. And so it meant that when we restarted when we went back into drought in 2017, we were not quite starting from scratch, but we were starting from a much lower base. And water efficiency and conservation take a while to build up. So I think that's probably my answer.
I'll echo that message, Ashraf. You know, it is the momentum of a boom bust methodology in water conservation doesn't sustain good behaviour. And really, you know, yes, we can rush out and change appliances, but we all know anybody who buys a washing machine or a shower head now are already efficient. So actually, it is about ingraining a habit and a behaviour in society, and doing a boom bust approach to that just doesn't work in the long run, and we really need to have a think about that. The other point to think about, Paul, was for the first time in memory, the droughts actually impacted all of the surface water catchments at the same time. So traditionally we've seen, you know, maybe Warragamba miss out, but the southern dams okay, or the southern dams miss out and Warragamba been okay. In reality, this drought covered all the surface water areas at the same time, and it's the first time we've actually observed that. What we actually did observe was it still rained in the city, maybe not as much as you would have historically seen, but what we had very little rain in the catchment, and the evaporation of the system matched basically the inflows to the system. So and then obviously demand from the city downstream as well. You know, between the two droughts, we had close to 1 million people move into the city as well. So couple of factors in parallel that kind of played the role.
I'd say that there's one more factor. So the rainfall was small, evaporation was high, but the other factor was, and it's been well predicted and it's been seen in other cities, is that the catchments are dry, and they're dry because temperatures are warmer. So if you have a warmer climate, you have more evaporation from the soil, dry soils, and then when the rain comes, which it did, there was rainfall, it's soaked up in the soil rather than generating runoff. That's exactly what Perth's seen. It's exactly what's been reported in California. It's a known consequence of warmer temperatures.
So you're getting less result for your rainfall in the context of that changing climate.
Yes, runoff reduces more than proportionally to the low rainfall.
Yeah, wow. So we've got a question. Jennifer, did you want to ask this question to Craig, or do you want me to do it?
I'm happy to ask. Yeah, Craig, I work for Sydney Water, and I know that we're doing a lot of work to improve greening in the newer areas, particularly out west. I was just wondering how an established council is going about greening the area, and how they balance that with water usage.
It's a very good question, and just our parks that we create, especially for the new growth areas, they're not irrigated. The only things that we irrigate are sporting fields, basically where it's a formal sporting field, we will irrigate it. If it's a passive grassed area or garden area, we will not irrigate it. We'll water it in for establishment, but then that's it. It very rarely gets water after that. So that's one thing as part of the strategy we're wanting to look at, and to work with Sydney Water and see if we can get recycled water to those parks, because I feel it's a bit of a waste if we're using potable water to irrigate those facilities, which is when we can be using stormwater or recycled water to irrigate them. And I guess one of the main issues for us, it's the funding for the irrigation systems. Again, we can't cover that under the current contribution plans. And also then you've got to pay for the water, which is obviously another issue as well. So I guess that's one thing that council needs to think about, and maybe we've in partnership with Sydney Water, if there is a recycled water supply nearby, that we look at integrating it and ensuring that those facilities do get the water that they need to remain green and to remain cool, especially during those really hot periods. But without a huge cost to council, because there's obviously a significant cost implication to us that we'll just have to pass on to someone else. Where if there's a recycled water supply, there's too much recycled water, which maybe not. If we're looking at using it for potable water up as well, there may not be that much of it in the future. But if there is too much recycled water, we should be looking at it as using that to the best of its ability and to make our parks greener and cooler.
Thanks, Craig.
Well, Paul, did you want to comment on that, or there's no need to? But just in terms, I mean, it sounds like there's, Blacktown is trying to balance a whole range of, inflows and demands and needs as and obviously Sydney Water has the kind of investment plans to address some of the bigger challenges, but also to deliver on those livable places, that kind of livable environment that you guys have been so clear on trying to design and achieve. How does that match with kind of what the local perspective is, I suppose?
Yeah. Thanks, Sam. As I alluded to earlier, I think the most important factor in all of this is the master planning in really early understanding of urban development. Blacktown have some relatively unique challenges. The urban densification as well as the green area sprawl in parallel. They've got both of those spaces at the moment, but they're not the only one. It's becoming more and more predominant around the city now. The earlier that we can work in partnership with councils and developers, we can find solutions. But it's a partnership to find those solutions, and the earlier we can do it in land use planning, the better. As I mentioned, the urban typology work earlier, we're really looking at what it means to unlock the potential of places like Mamre Road and the Aerotropolis. But that can apply in any urban development with a bit of lateral thinking and collaboration. Will hopefully in many cases find new ways of doing things that will unlock and sustain the potential. The city's committed to putting 7 million trees out there. Now the trees are only as good as they're healthy, even in a drought. So yes, you can plant trees, but there'll be some use, but not as maximum use in a drought as if they were watered or irrigated in some way. So really thinking about that early and collaboratively is going to be the outcome that we all have to work towards.
Just one more quick thing on that. So we are trialling a program with passively watered street trees. So using stormwater collected from the gutter when it does rain, and actually storing it in the soil in around street trees and making sure that those trees remain healthy as possible into the future. And that can be expanded into parkland settings as well. However, it is just a trial at the moment. So we'll see how we go in terms of the cost benefit analysis and go from there.
And just build on that, Craig, a really important factor is if we don't capture it and use it, it ends up in the creeks.
Yeah.
And the amount of urban development, that isn't sustainable either. So it isn't just about a sort of water supply solution, it's about a water cycle solution, and how we can actually manage all aspects of the water cycle to achieve that.
Great, thanks, Paul and Craig. Just Caroline, I'm going to squeeze your question in, and we're getting really close to time.
Just a really quick question. Caroline Seagrove from CSIRO. Managed aquifer recharge is a low-cost technology that's been successfully deployed in a number of other Australian states, but I understand there have been regulatory constraints in New South Wales. So I just wondered if that proven technology is being considered as part of the solution for Greater Sydney.
A great question, Caroline. Unfortunately, Sydney is not blessed with good aquifers. So there are two major aquifers in the city. One's in Botany, and one's in just outside of Penrith. Neither of which are very big, and really, as a economic and sustainable solution for the city, they're not big enough to make it viable for use to service the Greater Sydney system. So we have looked at it, we've explored it, and we've not completely given up on it. But in terms of scale of opportunity, the geology of Greater Sydney, it just doesn't match the requirements, unfortunately.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, Caroline. Was conscious of time, guys. It's been a really great discussion. Thank you very much, and thanks to everybody who joined and asked questions. And thank you very much to the speakers. I know that there's a whole heap of work left to do for Ash and Paul and Stuart as part of the advisory team, and Craig from a local government perspective in terms of finalising the Greater Sydney Water Strategy. And this conversation is definitely not over. We'll definitely come back to you in the new year with the next round and the next discussion about taking this further. But really appreciate all of your time this morning. Hope you got a lot out of the discussion, and looking forward to the next one. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.